The gauze was supposed to alphabetized by size, not by expiration date, and Margaret Walsh had been reorganizing Cedar Creek Medical's Trauma Bay 3 for exactly 4 minutes when she noticed the pharmaceutical order didn't match the patient census. She worked the shelves with practiced efficiency, her movements fluid and economical, each hand knowing exactly where to place each box before the other hand had finished reaching. 4x4 gauze pads. 2x2 gauze pads. The rhythm was meditative, the kind of work that let your hands move on their own while your mind catalogued the discrepancies. 3 years at Cedar Creek. 36 months of shifts that started at 6 in the morning and didn't end until the fluorescent lights seemed like they'd always been flickering, their electrical buzz becoming the white noise of her life. She'd worn the same dark blue scrubs long enough that they'd faded at the shoulders, and her name badge, Margaret Walsh, RN, was scratched along one edge where it caught on the supply cart handles. Nobody looked at that badge and saw anything except a tired nurse in her early 50s restocking trauma supplies, the kind of invisible fixture that existed in hospitals the same way walls existed. Present. Necessary. Unremarkable. The pharmacy paperwork sat clipped to her clipboard on the adjacent counter, the pages already beginning to yellow at the edges from the heat of the ER. She'd pulled them during her intake break, the way she pulled them every shift now, fentanyl orders that arrived in quantities 3 times higher than the patient volume suggested, equipment purchase invoices with prices that made no sense when compared to standard medical supplier catalogs, billing codes that didn't correspond to any procedures she'd assisted with or documented. The patterns had started small. A missing shipment here. A discrepancy there. But 3 years of noticing meant 3 years of accumulation, 3 years of careful handwriting in the margins of her intake logs, 3 years of knowing that something in the administrative machinery of Cedar Creek Medical was clicking forward to a rhythm that had nothing to do with patient care. She didn't report it. Not yet. Not because she was afraid. She'd held people together under mortar fire in a field hospital that should have been overrun by 0300 hours, and fear was something her nervous system had learned to recognize as information rather than instruction. She didn't report it because she was invisible, and invisible people who asked too many questions tended to be noticed in ways that were impossible to take back. There were rules. There were protocols. And there was the particular kind of caution that came from having disappeared once already, from having signed documents in a Pentagon basement that promised her some version of ordinary life if she kept her mouth shut and her head down. Dr. Mercer watched her from the opposite end of the ER, his gaze moving across her in the way it always did, quick, dismissive, the way a man might glance at his watch and see only the time, not the craftsmanship. He was 5 years her junior, maybe $3,000 per month richer in salary, and he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from never having been wrong about anything that mattered. His white coat was pristine. His hairline had begun its retreat, but he compensated for it with the kind of precision that suggested he spent time in front of mirrors, and his posture suggested that he'd never had to consider the possibility of his own irrelevance. She didn't meet his eyes. That was part of the system too, the way she'd learned to move through Cedar Creek Medical like water moving around rocks, present but not intrusive, helpful but not memorable. Her hands continued their work. The for X for S went into their assigned slot. The 2x2s followed with the same methodical precision. Behind her, the ventilator in the adjacent trauma bay wheezed its mechanical rhythm, the sound so constant now that she'd stopped consciously registering it, the way you stopped hearing the hum of the hospital itself after you'd worked it long enough. Beeping monitors. Padding footsteps on linoleum. The distant alarm from somewhere down the corridor that meant a patient had wandered or fallen and some other invisible RN was already moving to respond. During her break, exactly 15 minutes at 2:56 p.m., documented in the staffing system, Margaret moved through the supply closet toward the back wall where she'd hung her jacket on a hook beside 3 other jackets that belonged to 3 other nurses who'd been here almost as long as she had. The closet was narrow enough that her shoulders nearly touched both sides, the air close and chemical-scented from the antiseptic bottle stacked on the shelves, and she reached for the inside pocket of her jacket with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested she'd done this before. Many times. The patch was inside, sewn into the lining 3 years ago with thread that matched the color of the fabric so precisely that no one would ever see it unless they were looking for it specifically. Faded olive drab. Embroidered in gold. The 5th Special Forces Group insignia, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, old enough that the stitching had begun to fray at one corner. Baghdad. 2009, 14 years ago. A different woman. A different name. She pressed her thumb against the patch, closed her eyes, and counted to 3. Her hands were steadier than they'd been in weeks. The fluorescent light above her flickered twice, then settled, and she opened her eyes and smoothed her jacket and returned to the floor as though she'd never left it. The admission notification came through at 3:04 p.m., a patient arriving via helicopter transport, medevac out of theater, injuries consistent with IED fragmentation, ETA to Cedar Creek Medical in 4 minutes. The nurses moved with the coordinated efficiency of people who'd done this enough times that their bodies knew the sequence before their minds had finished processing the announcement. Trauma Bay 2 was already prepared. The code cart was positioned. The ventilator settings were being verified. Margaret began pulling for supplies with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else, muscle memory taking over in the way it always did when the adrenaline started to prime. The patient came through the doors in a transport with rotors still slowing outside, the kind of controlled chaos that the ER had learned to absorb like a sponge takes water. He was young, mid-20s, maybe, though the shock and blood loss made everyone look ageless, and his chest was a constellation of dark puncture wounds, shrapnel embedded in the soft tissue around his ribs in patterns that suggested the explosion had happened close enough that he should have died but survived anyway through some combination of luck and angle and the particular mercy of trauma that occasionally allowed people to keep breathing. His uniform was blood-stained and torn. His dog tags reflected the ER lights as the transport team lowered him from the stretcher to the trauma bay bed. And Margaret's hands froze for exactly 1 second. She knew that face. She knew the shape of his shoulders. She knew the scar on his left forearm from when a mortar round had clipped him outside the aid station in Ramadi, and she knew the way his eyes moved even in shock, scanning for threat assessment and counting personnel the way certain men's nervous systems never stopped doing. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen. The medic who'd taken her slot after she'd disappeared. The man who'd walked through Baghdad when she couldn't, who'd done the work she'd been trained to do, who'd become the ghost in her absence. Name, she asked, her voice level and professional, the kind of voice you used when you were documenting an intake and nothing else mattered except the data. Sergeant Marcus Chen. 75th Ranger Regiment. She didn't react. Didn't flinch. Didn't do anything except write the information in the chart with the same steady hand she'd been using for 3 years, the same hand that had notarized pharmaceutical discrepancies and medication logs and all the small careful catalogues of wrongness that she'd accumulated in this hospital like a woman gathering stones. Her knuckles didn't whiten. Her jaw didn't tighten. The tremor in her right hand only appeared when she held the pen too still, trying to keep it motionless, the kind of fine motor shake that came from systems running too hard on too little sleep and too much awareness. Okay, Ranger Chen. I'm going to get you stabilized. You're in Norfolk. Cedar Creek Medical. Best facility within 200 miles for what you're carrying. She moved through the examination with the kind of focus that existed in a space beyond memory or recognition or the particular weight of seeing someone you'd known walk through the doors bleeding. Vitals. For access. Wound assessment. The shrapnel had entered through the anterior chest wall, the fragmentation pattern suggesting an explosive device detonated within close proximity, the kind of wound that in a field hospital in Baghdad would have required a decision between treatment and triage, between investing resources in someone who might not survive and moving to the next patient. But this wasn't Baghdad. This was a Level 1 trauma center with 2 surgeons on standby and imaging capability and the kind of modern medicine that could occasionally pull people back from the edge. The pharmaceutical discrepancies didn't matter right now. The billing codes didn't matter. The patterns that Margaret had been noticing for 36 months could wait. What mattered was the presence of a man who'd been her medic, who'd served under her command before the rules changed and she'd vanished, who'd probably spent 14 years believing she was either dead or permanently retired from the kind of work that required you to make impossible decisions about which lives you could save and which ones you couldn't. As she worked, Dr. Mercer stood at the entrance to the trauma bay, watching the organized chaos with his hands clasped behind his back. His gaze moved across the patient, across the equipment, across Margaret herself as she moved through her assessment with a kind of precision that suggested the work wasn't actually difficult for her, the way some people carried their expertise so casually that it looked like ordinary competence. He didn't know what he was looking at. Didn't know that he was watching hands that had held lives together under conditions that his mind couldn't quite construct. Didn't know that the aging nurse restocking gauze in Trauma Bay 3 that morning had commanded Special Forces medics in Baghdad, had made triage decisions that meant some people lived and some people died based on mathematics and likelihood and the brutal economics of finite resources. Didn't know that the woman writing his patient's admission vitals was the reason 317 people had survived beyond the point when they should have stopped breathing. What happened next would change everything. But for now, Margaret simply continued her work. The grand rounds assembled like a courtroom, 12 rotating residents clustered around the monitors in their crisp white coats, their tablets glowing in the fluorescent wash of Trauma Bay 3. Dr. Mercer positioned himself directly beside Margaret, close enough that she could smell the cologne underneath the antiseptic, something expensive and aggressive, like a claim of territory. She continued her assessment of Chen's vitals without acknowledgement, her finger steady on the blood pressure cuff even as she felt his presence like a spotlight, and she knew what was coming before he opened his mouth. "Nurse Walsh here," Mercer announced, his voice pitched to carry across the bay, "represents everything we're trying to move past in modern emergency medicine. Outdated triage protocols from, what, the 90s? He turned to the residents with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Failure to respect the chain of command. Persistent confusion about contemporary standards of care. The younger nurses studied their tablets with sudden intensity, their shoulders tightening at the familiar rhythm of his contempt. Margaret continued documenting Chen's oxygen saturation, 91%, climbing slightly, her penmanship perfect as her knuckles whitened around the metal clipboard. She did not look up. She did not defend herself. The silence that followed his words was the kind that comes from years of watching someone try to break something that refuses to break. Chen's eyes tracked her from the bed, something flickering behind the morphine haze, a moment of recognition that he seemed to be fighting through the fog of medication. Margaret didn't meet his gaze. Instead, she initiated the fall line with a precision that made one of the residents lean forward slightly, a clean stick on the first attempt, the catheter sliding home with a kind of fluid certainty that comes from 10,000 repetitions, from hands that remembered more than hospitals could teach. The silence stretched until Mercer's frustration began to show, a tightness around his jawline when she still said nothing, still did not react, still simply continued her work as though he were a passing observation about the weather. 2 hours later, Margaret pushed through the break room door on the 3rd floor, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing their tired song. The vending machines hummed in the corner, and Mercer stood before them like a trap, flanked now by 2 administrators whose expressions suggested they had been summoned rather than convinced. Margaret slowed, reading the formation the way she might read an ambush, power distributed, witnesses present, escape routes considered. She had seen tactics like this in briefing rooms where careerism mattered more than competence. "Your pharmaceutical questioning caused quite a stir," Mercer said, his voice carrying the synthetic brightness of performance. The administrators smiled. "Someone your age might be confused about modern standards. Chain of command exists for a reason, Grandma." He let the nickname hang in the recycled air like a weapon. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at a nursing home. As a resident, not staff." The administrator on his left actually chuckled, the sound hollow and calculated. Margaret's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Her right hand trembled as she opened her water bottle, the only crack in her professional mask, the only concession to the fury she had learned to weaponize into silence. She took a slow breath, the kind that centers vision and clears thinking, and she met Mercer's eyes for exactly 1 second, a look that held no anger, no defense, only the flat observation of someone assessing a problem. Then she turned and walked back toward the stairwell, leaving him standing there with his administrators, uncertain whether he had won or been dismissed, which was the only victory she could safely take. The evening shift deteriorated like most evenings did, medication errors caught by cross-checking, a patient whose vitals trended downward requiring escalation, the constant low-level chaos of 30 beds demanding attention that no single nurse could fully provide. Around 8 o'clock, Mercer appeared at the nurse's station during shift change, his voice pitched loud enough that conversation on the entire floor stopped like a light switch. "Security can escort you out if you can't adapt, Grandma. I have the authority. Don't test me." The threat was audible, the power source behind it made visible. He had administration, he had policy, he had the institutional machinery that could turn a nurse into a cautionary tale. Margaret met his eyes once, a brief moment of acknowledgement that was not submission, then returned to her medication logs. Her hand did not shake. Her voice remained level when she spoke to the pharmacy tech. She signed off on Chen's pain medication with perfect penmanship, each letter precise as a military seal. Mercer waited for some response, a crack, a defense, an opening he could exploit, but she had learned long ago that the most powerful resistance was simply to keep working, to refuse him the satisfaction of a reaction. When her shift ended at 11, Margaret moved through the hospital like a ghost, clocking out at the main desk, collecting her jacket from her locker in the staff room. The supply closet beckoned at the far end of the hallway, a small room filled with trauma shears and sterile gauze packages and the musty smell of stored linens. She stepped inside, closed the door, and stood in the semi-darkness for a moment, allowing the professional mask to slip. Her fingers found the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the 5th Special Forces Group insignia stitched so carefully that it would never catch on a pocket or snag under scrutiny. The patch had been with her since Baghdad, since the day the Pentagon lawyers had scrubbed her records and ordered her to become someone else, someone smaller, someone who could be insulted in grand rounds without visibly flinching. She touched the patch the way someone might touch a talisman or a reminder of who they actually were underneath the scrubs and the deference and the careful construction of invisibility. She closed her eyes. 3 seconds, she allowed herself. 3 seconds of acknowledging that Mercer had found exactly the right pressure point, not violence, which she could absorb, but the slow corrosion of respect, the public dismantling of her competence, the subtle message that 3 years of service meant nothing when challenged by someone with institutional power and arrogance in equal measure. Then she opened her eyes, straightened her jacket, and returned the mask to her face like putting on a helmet. The supply closet dissolved behind her. The hallway stretched toward the trauma bays. The sound of the ER, the soft beep of monitors, the hydraulic wheeze of automatic doors, the distant call of an overhead page, pulled her back into the landscape of her temporary life. She was walking back toward the nurse's station when the emergency department's entire atmosphere changed. The automatic doors exploded inward as though struck by something massive, and a figure emerged from the night, a man 7 feet tall, possibly 270 pounds, his body moving with the uncontrolled violence of someone whose chemistry had abandoned the premises. A tire iron swung in wide arcs from his right hand, his screams incoherent and guttural, his mouth open like an animal's. The waiting room collapsed into motion. A mother grabbed her child and dove behind a chair. An elderly couple scrambled toward the far corner. 2 orderlies sprint toward the triage desk and crouch behind the counter, their radios already crackling with calls for security. A nurse wheeled a patient backward toward the medication room, her face pale with calculation about locking mechanisms and bullet-resistant glass. The security guards in the lobby retreated, calling their dispatch for police response, their hands already reaching for protocols that involved negotiation and distance. Dr. Mercer's office door clicked shut with the audible precision of a lock engaging. But Margaret stood at the nurse's station, 40 feet from the epicenter of chaos, and her eyes did something that none of the other staff noticed. They narrowed, focused, catalogued. She registered the gray pallor beneath the rage, the distended neck veins pulsing with something more than anger, the way he clawed at his chest between swings of the tire iron as though trying to remove something trapped inside him. His lips held the faintest tint of blue. His breathing was rapid and shallow, desperate, the gasping pattern of someone suffocating from the inside out. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, building pressure with each breath, collapsing the lung, crushing the heart. The pressure climbing toward the moment when his cardiac output would simply stop. Everyone in the ER saw a violent threat. Margaret saw a dying patient. She set down her clipboard with deliberate calm. She stood, the motion slow and visible so as not to startle him further. Her trembling hand from the vending machines, that had been fear of humiliation, of losing ground in an institutional hierarchy. This trembling would not come, This was different. This was the tremor that comes from stepping across a line that cannot be uncrossed. She walked directly toward him, her hands raised at shoulder height, palms visible and empty. Her movements precise as a sniper's approach. Her voice dropped into a register she had not used in 3 years, a register that had once directed combat medics during mortar fire in the Jolan district of Fallujah, a voice that held the weight of command and the certainty of someone who had already survived the worst. "Sir, look at me. You cannot breathe. I will help you." The words came out clipped, authoritative, a battlefield voice in a hospital corridor. She did not ask. She did not request. She commanded. He swung the tire iron. The arc of it whistled through the space where her head had been a fraction of a second before, and Margaret did not flinch, did not pause, did not calculate distance and probability. She simply took another step forward, her eyes locked on his, her voice dropping lower, hitting a frequency that bypassed panic and spoke directly to the survival centers of the brain. "Drop the weapon. Sit down. I will help you breathe." The entire ER held its collective breath, suspended between violence and salvation, between the chaos that Mercer had fled from and the competence that he had spent 3 years trying to dismantle. And then everything changed. The automatic doors exploded inward at 11:02 p.m. A 7-foot man filled the entrance like a storm front, his screams guttural and wordless, the sound of something breaking inside a human throat. His body was all angles and rage, shoulders too wide for the doorway, arms that swung a tire iron in widening arcs that caught the fluorescent light like a blade. The metal whistle sang through the air, close enough to clip the plastic trim of the registration desk. Chaos fractured into motion. Patients scrambled toward exits, overturning chairs with the blind panic of prey animals. An elderly woman's purse tumbled across the tile floor, contents scattering like debris. A young father scooped his daughter into his arms and ran for the far corridor, her shoes dangling, her voice lost in the noise. Someone knocked over a wheeled tray of instruments, the crash of steel on linoleum cut through everything, metallic and final. Nurses dove behind stations. The charge nurse hit the ground behind the central desk, her radio skittering across the counter. The new graduate, barely 3 months on the job, curled into the supply closet, her hand trembling as she pulled the door shut. A phlebotomist pressed herself against the cabinet beneath the blood draw station, making herself small, invisible, gone. The tire iron came down hard against a vacant chair. The plastic back shattered into fragments. Dr. Mercer's office door opened. He stood framed in the doorway for 3 seconds, enough time to assess, to calculate, to understand that this was not a situation his credentials or his position could control. His face went still. Then the door closed again, the lock engaging with a definitive click that echoed through the ER like a declaration. He had abandoned the floor, abandoned the patients, abandoned every principle he would later claim to uphold. But Margaret saw something else. She saw the grey pallor creeping beneath the man's dark skin, the color of compromised perfusion. She saw his neck veins distended like rope, bulging against the muscle beneath his jaw. She saw the way he clawed at his chest between swings of the tire iron, his free hand pressing against his ribs as if something inside was trying to claw its way out. His breathing was rapid, shallow, desperate, the breathing of someone suffocating while standing upright. Not a violent man. A dying man. Tension pneumothorax. Or cardiac crisis. Or both. The violence was just the body's last language when the lungs couldn't fill and the brain was starving for oxygen. Aggression was a symptom she'd learned to read under fire in Baghdad, in a field hospital where the difference between a threat and a medical emergency was sometimes just the light coming through the sandbags. Margaret straightened. Deliberately. Slowly. She set down the clipboard she'd been holding. The sound of it hitting the counter was small, precise, a notification to her own nervous system that she was moving into a different register, shifting from the invisible RN in sensible shoes to something else entirely. Something older. Something that had already survived the worst. The man's eyes rolled toward her. Unseeing. His pupils blown wide, flooding his irises until only thin rings of brown remained. Margaret walked toward him. Not ran. Not rushed. Walked with the steady, measured pace of someone who had moved across open ground under active fire, who understood that speed created panic and panic created victims. Her hands were visible, empty, held at waist level where he could see them. No threat. No equipment. Just presence. "Sir," she said. Her voice dropped an octave. It came from deeper in her chest now, from a register she hadn't used in 3 years of restocking trauma bays and taking orders from men like Mercer. It came from the register that had directed medics under mortar fire, that had kept 20 people alive for 14 hours when the position was overrun and extraction was still 8 hours out. It came from the voice of Captain Margaret Walsh, who had not existed in this hospital until this moment. The low command voice cut through the chaos like a knife through water. The man's tire iron dropped slightly. Just fractionally. But enough. "You're having trouble breathing," Margaret continued. Same register. Same steady intonation. Not a question. A diagnosis. A statement of fact that required no argument or agreement. "That's the pressure in your chest. Not your fault. Not your mind. Your body needs help, and I'm going to help you. That's all that's happening here." She was 6 feet away now. The man's breathing was rapid, panicked, 28, 30 breaths per minute, his body burning through oxygen it couldn't absorb. His skin was slicked with sweat. The tire iron trembled in his grip, not from anger but from the fine muscle tremors of hypoxia, the shaking that came when the brain started dying, cell by cell. "I need you to drop the tire iron," Margaret said. Same voice. Not louder. Clearer. The kind of clear that cut through confusion and pain and fear because it was the only thing in the room that wasn't chaos. "Drop it now. It won't help you." "I will." Somewhere behind the central desk, a nurse was on the phone with security. Boots were coming. Response times measured in minutes while this man had maybe seconds. The math was simple. It always was. The tire iron hit the tile floor with a sound like a final bell. He collapsed forward immediately after, his legs giving way as if the weapon had been the only thing keeping him upright. His body fell toward the ER floor, a 7-foot frame, all dead weight, dangerous in its descent. Margaret was already moving. Her hand caught him before he hit, one arm hooking beneath his armpit, the other steadying his shoulder as she guided his collapse toward the ground instead of letting him slam down like a falling tree. Muscle memory took over, the same way she'd caught privates on their way down in Baghdad, the same mechanics of controlled descent that meant the difference between a casualty and a recovery. She lowered him to the tile floor as a gurney appeared beside her, the charge nurse having moved with the same efficiency once the immediate threat shifted from violence to medicine. "I need a 14-gauge angiocath needle, now." Margaret's voice cracked across the frozen ER like a whip, and there was no deference in it, no question marks, no softening. This was command. The younger nurse, new graduate, 3 months, froze at the supply closet door. "I said move." Margaret's hands were already finding the landmarks on his chest. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The anatomical roadmap she'd memorized on a dusty forward operating base where textbooks came wrapped in plastic and the only light was what came through sandbags. Her fingers pressed down, identifying the exact space where the pleura had ruptured and the pressure was collapsing the lung, suffocating him from the inside out. She didn't wait for the needle. She grabbed a trauma kit from the crash cart, the move happening before conscious thought, just hands and knowledge and 7 years of medical training compressed with 4 years of military field medicine into a single point of action. She positioned the needle. Steady. Precise. No hesitation in the movement. She drove it through the chest wall in one smooth motion. The hiss came immediately, the sound of air escaping under pressure, the sound of a tension being released, the sound of physics correcting itself. The trapped air that had been crushing his lung rushed out through the needle hub, equalizing the pressure, allowing his chest wall to expand. His body drew a sudden, desperate breath. Another. His color shifted, the gray pallor easing back toward pink, oxygen returning to perfusion, the dying man becoming a medical emergency that could be managed. O2 kit to the South Bay, now, Margaret called out, not looking away from the chest wall, from the seal she was maintaining with her palm pressed around the needle. Get me a chest tube tray. 32 French. And push 500 micrograms fentanyl for, he's going to feel this when I place the tube. The ER moved now. The charge nurse was shouting orders, the nurses emerging from behind their desks with the muscle memory of crisis response taking over. The chaos had transformed into something organized, something medical, something that Margaret could direct. 20 feet away, from his bed in Trauma Bay 2, Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen watched through his morphine haze. He watched Margaret move, the precision, the speed, the absolute authority with which she had walked toward the threat while everyone else fled. He watched her hands on the chest, watched her speak commands that the entire ER obeyed without question. He watched her face, saw the scar that ran from her left temple down toward her jaw, barely visible in a harsh fluorescent light but unmistakable if you'd been looking for it. If you'd been remembering. Something clicked behind his eyes. His lips moved. A word formed, silently at first, just the shape of it against his teeth. He mouthed it into the fall line, into the oxygen mask, into the 3 years of thinking she was gone, swept up and disappeared the way the military made people disappear when operations went sideways. Valkyrie. That was what they'd called her in Baghdad. The medic who wouldn't retreat, who held the position when they should have all been dead, who walked toward the sound of gunfire while everyone else was running the other direction. Dr. Mercer's office door opened slowly. He watched from the doorway as Margaret worked, her body positioned between the patient and the crash cart, her voice directing traffic with the confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times under worse conditions. She was completely in control. The ER had shifted its hierarchy without a single word being spoken. She was the authority now. She was the one giving orders. She was the one everyone listened to. His face calculated. From his desk, the charge nurse was staring at him, watching him watch her work. There was something in that stare, recognition, maybe, of what he'd done when he'd locked the door. What he'd chosen. The hospital administrator was on the phone now, probably calling Mercer, probably asking where he was, why he wasn't in the ER directing response. Mercer's mouth tightened into a thin line. Within 15 minutes, as paramedics stabilized the man for transport, his oxygen sat at 94% now, his breathing normalized, his color shifted toward something that resembled life. Mercer pulled the charge nurse aside. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man who understood that he'd lost the room but was already calculating how to retake it. I need every witness statement about that unauthorized invasive procedure, he said quietly. And pull Walsh's personnel file. Every disciplinary report. Every incident. Everything. The charge nurse hesitated. Her voice came out uncertain. There aren't any disciplinary. Then start documenting them, Mercer said. The words came out flat. Final. Tonight. I want incident reports for her first 3 months here. Protocol she violated. Insubordination. Chart violations. Anything. Everything. The charge nurse didn't move. Didn't respond. Just stared at him with something in her eyes that looked like understanding, like she was watching a man dig, and she could see how deep the hole was already becoming. Margaret stood at the supply cart, her hand still steady, her breathing still controlled, reloading the trauma tray with the kind of methodical precision that suggested she hadn't just saved a dying man using equipment and technique that technically required a physician's authorization. She didn't look at Mercer. Didn't acknowledge his stare. Just methodically returned the supplies to their places, counted the gauze, noted what needed restocking. But the other nurses watched her. Really watched her. Chen watched her. And in that watching, something had shifted in the hospital that couldn't be unshifted, some recognition of competence that no credential could contest. Dr. Mercer returned to his office and closed the door. The lock engaged again. But it sounded different this time. Like the sound of a man securing a perimeter he was no longer sure he controlled. The man's eyes rolled back in his skull as Margaret's voice cut through the noise of the ER like a blade through surgical silk. His body didn't recognize the command, but every neuron fired in response to the authority in her tone, the same frequency that had once steadied bleeding soldiers in desert heat. The tire iron wavered. His breathing accelerated, then caught, as if his nervous system couldn't decide between fight and flight when confronted with someone who was neither. The weapon clattered to the tile floor. The sound echoed through the trauma bay like a dropped shell casing. 700 pounds of rage and confusion collapsed forward, momentum carrying him down, his body hitting the ground with a thud that shook the stretcher wheels parked nearby. His full weight folded. His consciousness folding with it. Margaret was already moving. Her hands found his trachea before his body stopped rolling. Fingers pressed into the soft tissue below his larynx, assessing. Her touch was diagnostic, surgical, the way a blind person reads Braille. She felt the distended jugular vein, the tracheal deviation, the rigid resistance of air trapped where it should be moving. Tension pneumothorax. Not rage. Not madness. Physics. A collapsed lung pressing against the mediastinum like a fist inside the chest cavity. The man wasn't violent because he was dangerous, he was violent because he couldn't breathe and his body was screaming for oxygen it couldn't access. She barked the order without preamble. 14-gauge angiocath. Midclavicular line, second intercostal space. Not a request. The authority in her voice sent a nurse scrambling toward the crash cart. No hesitation. No second guessing. The timid RN they dismissed for 3 years had vanished. What emerged was something else entirely. Someone accustomed to leading medical teams while mortars walked fire across their position. Margaret positioned herself over the man's exposed chest, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had performed this exact procedure while sand fell like rain and the sound of automatic weapons provided the soundtrack. She identified the decompression point, the space between the ribs, the anatomical landmark that meant the difference between life and the slow suffocation of a tension pneumothorax. The nurse pressed the needle into her palm. 14-gauge. The needle was thin as a whisper but with enough diameter to allow pressurized air to escape. Margaret's free hand anchored the chest wall, her fingers bracing the ribs. She inserted the needle through skin, subcutaneous tissue, then through the pleura with one smooth motion, no hesitation, no tremor. Medical school graduates took hours to learn this procedure in controlled environments with mannequins. Margaret had performed it twice during a 14-hour siege when the hospital shook with each explosion and casualties arrived faster than the surgical team could process them. The hiss of air escaping was immediate. Not metaphorical. Not literary. Actual air under pressure releasing from the thoracic cavity with an audible release that made 3 nurses in the vicinity flinch. The man's chest deflated slightly. His body's desperation eased. Oxygen saturation began climbing, 62%, 67%, 73%, as the pneumothorax decompressed and normal lung mechanics reasserted themselves. The man's color returned. Cyanosis fading from his lips. His breathing normalized from the frantic hyperventilation of someone drowning in air to the steady, measured rhythm of adequate oxygenation. His body relaxed into unconsciousness, but the kind brought on by oxygen deprivation resolving, not the kind of cardiac collapse they'd all half expected when a 7-foot meth addict with a tire iron collapsed in the middle of the trauma bay. Margaret completed the stabilization with the efficiency of routine. She confirmed breath sounds with a stethoscope, equal and bilateral, the sound like wind through trees returning to healthy lungs. She established for access for fluid resuscitation. She called for a chest X-ray and a thoracic surgeon consult. Each action flowed into the next with the precision of muscle memory, not the 3 years of civilian nursing muscle memory, but the deeper kind. The kind etched into neural pathways by hundreds of hours under conditions where mistakes meant body bags. EMS arrived 3 minutes later, their uniforms crisp, their equipment gleaming. They stared at the 7-foot man now lying peacefully on the stretcher with a properly functioning airway and vital signs climbing toward stable. They looked at Margaret, then at each other. No one asked who had stabilized him. The scene told the story. the needle still protruding from his chest. The oxygen monitor displaying numbers that should have taken a full trauma team 30 minutes to achieve. The man alive and breathing when every probability said he should have been dead before the first responder finished his initial assessment. But in Trauma Bay 2, Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen had been conscious for all of it. Morphine dulled the shrapnel wounds across his chest, but it didn't dull his memory. It didn't dull the recognition that bloomed in his chest like a flare shot into Baghdad night sky. He recognized the voice. Not the hesitant, deferential tone she'd used during his intake assessment, but the real one, the one that had directed him through the chaos of a FOB overrun by insurgents, the voice that had told him to apply pressure here, administer saline there, hold that 4-line steady while rounds impacted the cinderblock walls around them. He recognized the movement. The way she positioned herself over the patient. The way she anchored the chest wall with absolute precision. The way she moved like someone who had done this not once in a simulation, not twice in textbooks, but dozens of times with the sounds of war providing the metronome. He recognized Captain Margaret Walsh, though he'd known her only as Margaret, the nurse who checked his chart and asked his name like she hadn't already saved his life 3 years ago in the wreckage of a hospital under siege. The same captain who had held a field surgical hospital together for 14 hours while everyone around her was either bleeding out or dying from wounds that couldn't be patched with bandages. The captain whose name was supposed to be erased, whose record was supposed to be classified, whose existence was supposed to be a Pentagon footnote filed in archives that would never be declassified. She was folding her stethoscope when the hospital administrator found her at the nurse's station. Dr. Mercer was at his shoulder, and behind them both stood a woman in a pressed suit who looked like she worked in compliance. The administrator's jaw was tight. He wasn't making eye contact. "Nurse Walsh," the administrator began, his voice careful, like a man choosing words from a list prepared by someone who wasn't him. "You performed an invasive surgical procedure without physician authorization. That creates significant liability exposure for Cedar Creek Medical." Margaret's hand tightened on the stethoscope. Just barely. Not enough for anyone who wasn't looking. But her fingers went white-knuckled for 1 second before she forced them to relax. Dr. Mercer stepped forward. "Your credentials are suspended effective immediately pending investigation into this unauthorized procedure. Security will escort you to collect your personal items." The woman from compliance said nothing. She was already documenting. Already preparing the paperwork that would transform Margaret's 3-year career at Cedar Creek Medical into a footnote in a disciplinary file. The kind of file that followed nurses from hospital to hospital like a scarlet letter, the kind that ensured they never worked in acute care again, the kind that was designed to break people. Margaret's face remained neutral. She nodded once, slowly, and stood. The security guard appeared, not rough, not aggressively escorting her out, but accompanying her with the kind of professional courtesy that made the humiliation worse somehow. She was being removed like a disgraced recruit. Like someone who couldn't be trusted. At her locker, she removed the jacket with the faded 5th Special Forces Group Unit patch sewn inside the lining. She'd worn that jacket for 3 years, had touched that patch in supply closets and break rooms and the car during shift changes, had let it anchor her to the identity that the Pentagon had ordered erased. She folded it with military precision, each crease exact, each edge aligned at perfect right angles, the kind of fold that would pass inspection on a parade ground. Then her scrubs. The hospital-issued scrubs that had become her uniform for a life she'd tried to build after everything else was taken from her. She folded each one, creating perfect rectangles, her hand steady as surgical steel. The laundry room was industrial and hot, steam pressing against her face like Baghdad heat. Like the moment the first IED went off outside the hospital perimeter. Like the sound of the chopper rotors that had eventually lifted her out to an extraction point where Pentagon lawyers had already prepared the paperwork that would make her disappear. Dr. Mercer appeared in the laundry room doorway. Behind him, staff scattered back to their stations, carefully not watching. He smiled. "You'll need to return your hospital scrubs, Grandma." Hospital property. Margaret stacked the folded scrubs on the counter, her hands never wavering. She signed the return form without comment. She handed over her badge, the one with her photo and the title registered nurse printed in clean, professional lettering. She walked toward the exit, each step measured, her spine perfectly vertical, her face a mask that revealed nothing except the terrible weight of a woman walking away from the only identity she'd been allowed to keep. But in Trauma Bay 2, Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen was reaching for his personal effects bag. His hands shook with the tremor of medication and pain, but his eyes were clear. He pulled out a piece of paper that had been folded and refolded so many times the creases had started to fray. A citation. From the Secretary of Defense. 16 years old. Commemorating actions under fire that officially never happened in a location that officially never saw the kind of siege warfare the papers described in clinical, precise language. The paper said Captain Margaret Walsh had held that position when everyone else was dead or dying. The paper said she'd personally treated 37 casualties. The paper said she'd directed defensive positions while bleeding from shrapnel wounds that should have incapacitated her. The paper said a lot of things that the Pentagon had spent millions of dollars trying to erase. But they were still there. Chen had kept them. And tomorrow, when Dr. Mercer arrived with his reporters and his carefully prepared narrative about proper emergency protocols and the dangers of unauthorized personnel, Chen would be ready. Within the hour, Dr. Mercer emerged from his locked office like a man possessed by certainty. His hands trembled, not with fear but with the hot certainty of a predator who'd found his opening. Margaret had crossed a line. She'd acted without authorization. She'd saved a life in a way that made him look like a coward, which meant she had to be buried. He moved through the corridors with purpose, his phone already in motion, calling the administrator's office. His voice carried the smooth authority of a man who'd spent 12 years learning exactly which pressure points to exploit. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. By the time he hung up, an emergency meeting was already being scheduled for 2 p.m. He had documents ready. Months of them. Small infractions he'd been collecting like a magpie collecting shiny objects, a medication log initialed 3 minutes late, a patient chart note that deviated slightly from institutional template, a single shift where she'd questioned a pharmaceutical order against his direct instruction. Nothing damning on its own. Everything damning together. He gathered his file from his locked desk drawer. 3 years of careful documentation. Some fabricated, some exaggerated, all of it curated with the precision of a man who understood that narrative was power and that the first person to define the story controlled the conversation. He slipped the file into a leather portfolio embossed with his initials and headed toward the administrator's office on the 3rd floor, moving like a man walking toward his own coronation. The meeting convened at 2:15 p.m. in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the parking lot where Margaret's 2009 Subaru sat like an artifact from another life. Dr. Mercer waited until the administrator, the HR director, and the risk management officer were seated before he spoke. His voice dropped into the register of a physician who'd spent years in medical school learning how to sound authoritative even when he was wrong. Captain Margaret Walsh has compromised patient safety and institutional liability through repeated acts of insubordination masked as medical initiative, he began, opening the file. He didn't call her Margaret. Captains belong to the military. Here, she was just Margaret. I have documentation spanning 36 months of progressive failure to respect chain of command, failure to follow established protocols, and repeated instances of what can only be described as reckless decision-making. He presented the first document. A patient complaint from 14 months prior, filed by a family member who'd objected to Margaret's suggestion that their father's pain medication dosage should be reviewed. It was legitimate paperwork. It proved nothing. But it looked damaging. Then another. A medication log where Margaret had questioned why a particular pharmaceutical quantity didn't match patient usage rates, exactly the sort of attentiveness that should have earned commendation from a hospital that claimed to value patient safety. Instead, Mercer reframed it. Challenging the judgment of a senior physician without proper channels, he said. Creating an atmosphere of questioning and doubt. The risk management officer leaned forward. The administrator's jaw tightened. They were listening now. Mercer continued, voice like a tank idling in a garage, powerful, low, impossible to ignore. This afternoon, she performed an invasive procedure without authorization. Needle decompression on a psychiatric patient in acute behavioral crisis. No attending physician present. No written protocol consultation. She made a clinical judgment call that could have resulted in catastrophic liability if the procedure had failed. Did it fail? The administrator asked. That's not the point, Mercer said smoothly. The point is institutional protocol. The point is that any nurse who believes they have the authority to override physician judgment and perform surgical interventions creates a liability nightmare. If something had gone wrong, if he'd coded, if she'd hit the wrong intercostal space, this hospital would be defending a case involving unauthorized personnel performing advanced procedures. He leaned back. Let that sink in. Liability. The word that made hospital administrators sweat faster than blood loss. I'm recommending immediate credential suspension pending a formal investigation. For the safety of patients. For the integrity of our protocols. For institutional protection. The HR director was already typing notes. The risk management officer was nodding. The administrator looked down at the file and saw 3 years of careful curation, isolation complaints, performance concerns, insubordination incidents, and made the decision that any risk-averse administrator would make. Better to suspend one nurse and protect the institution than to second-guess a senior physician who was offering a clear narrative with documented evidence. I'll contact legal, the administrator said. She'll be notified this afternoon. Mercer stood, closed his portfolio, and left. He had just enough time to get coffee before security escorted Margaret to the legal office for formal notification of credential suspension pending investigation. He would make sure he was nowhere near that conversation. He would make sure he looked shocked if anyone asked. He would make sure the narrative remained his. The notification arrived at 3:48 p.m. Margaret was in the supply room restocking trauma kits when she was called to the administrator's office. The legal counsel was waiting, a thin man in a grey suit who'd perfected the art of delivering bad news with bureaucratic precision. The suspension letter was on embossed hospital letterhead. It cited unauthorized invasive procedures, failure to follow protocol, and liability exposure. It suspended her credentials pending a formal investigation that would take 60 to 90 days. During that time, she was not permitted on hospital grounds except to meet with the investigation committee. Margaret held the letter and read it once. Her face showed nothing. Her hands remained steady. She'd read orders under fire. She'd seen command decisions that sent people to their deaths. A credential suspension was administrative noise. But the point was understood. Mercer had moved beyond humiliation into active sabotage. He'd weaponized the institution itself. She signed the acknowledgement letter and left without asking questions. That evening, she sat in her apartment in the dark, the letter on the kitchen table in front of her. She could fight this. She could present documentation of her training, her experience, her knowledge of advanced trauma protocols. But the moment she did, she'd expose questions that the Pentagon had spent years keeping buried. Fighting this meant surfacing. Staying silent meant accepting erasure. The next morning, she arrived at Cedar Creek Medical at 5:27 a.m., before the day's shift began, before anyone was watching. She went to the hospital laundry room where she'd spent hundreds of shifts, a place of steam and soap and the institutional smell of bleach that never quite washed out of your clothes. The laundry room was empty except for the industrial washers and the sound of them churning, mechanical and indifferent. She began folding her scrubs. The blue one she'd worn for 3 years. She creased each edge with military precision, perfect angles, corners tight as hospital corners, the kind of fold that left nothing to chance. The steam from the nearby machines pressed against her face like the heat of the Baghdad summer she'd left behind, the kind of heat that made you feel like the air itself was burning. She folded them methodically. Blue scrubs. White lab coat. The badge with her name and the title RN that had become her entire identity. Her locker was in the staff break room. She collected it at 6:15 a.m., moving like she was clearing a compound, efficient, methodical, leaving nothing behind. She removed her personal items. A photo of the team. A spare stethoscope. And then she reached inside the jacket pocket where the faded unit patch had lived for 3 years, sewn into the lining, invisible to anyone who didn't know to look. The 5th Special Forces Group insignia. Gold and green and bearing the weight of 14 hours of continuous fire and every decision she'd made in the 3 years that followed. She held it for 3 seconds. Then she placed it carefully in her bag. Not hidden anymore. Not yet. But not hidden anymore. By 6:41 a.m., Margaret Walsh had collected everything that mattered and walked out of Cedar Creek Medical. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. She didn't leave a note. The Pentagon's orders had been clear the day she signed her name in blood and ink: remain buried. Maintain the silence. Return to obscurity if the operational cover was compromised. She was returning to obscurity. The question was whether it would hold. That evening, Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen lay in his hospital bed, still recovering from the shrapnel wounds, and asked a nurse he trusted to find him the official hospital incident report from the trauma bay that afternoon. The nurse brought it, curious why a patient would request paperwork. Chen read the account of the 7-foot man and the emergency decompression. The account attributed the procedure to the attending physician direction and listed Dr. Mercer as the supervising physician. It was a beautiful lie. Completely documented. Entirely false. Chen knew what Margaret was. He'd served under her command in Baghdad. He'd seen her make decisions that saved lives when making those decisions meant risking everything. He'd watched her disappear after the operation went sideways, knowing she'd taken the fall so the rest of them could come home clean. Now he was looking at her being erased a second time. Not by the Pentagon. By a man who was rewriting her heroism into his own narrative, claiming credit for the life she'd saved, building a case against her for being exactly the thing she'd been trained to be: a leader under fire. Chen's hand moved to the drawer beside his bed where his visitor had left his personal effects. Inside was a citation. Faded, worn, but real. Captain Margaret Walsh. Extraordinary heroism. Baghdad 2009. His hand shook as he held it, and he made a decision that would change everything. But that part wasn't Margaret's story anymore. That part belonged to the young medic who'd learned everything he knew from a woman the world was trying to forget. That part belonged to the moment when silence finally broke. Margaret drove away from Cedar Creek Medical in her 2009 Subaru, the unit patch on the seat beside her, and didn't look back. She was already planning her next city, her next identity, her next way to disappear. She didn't know that the man in the hospital bed was about to make her reappearance inevitable. She didn't know that being forgotten was about to end. All she knew was the road ahead and the sound of her own breathing, steady and even, the way it had always been. The way it had to be. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were actually standing next to, subscribe for more stories about the quiet ones who change everything. Like this video, comment below, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story about the real heroes hiding in plain sight. See you next time.